The young mother moved through the village with a quiet grace, her steps measured, her presence gentle, yet full of life. Her name was known to all, not for wealth or status, but for the warmth she carried in every gesture, every word. From the earliest light of dawn, she could be seen tending her small garden, humming soft melodies as she nurtured the earth, coaxing tender shoots of vegetables and flowers toward the sun. Children in the village loved her, not just because she often shared sweet fruits or told stories of distant lands, but because she listened to them with undivided attention, laughing at their jokes, wiping away tears, and celebrating their small victories as though they were her own. Her bond with her child was the very heart of her existence. The little one, barely past infancy, clung to her in both delight and necessity. When she carried the child through the village streets, neighbors would pause, offering smiles or quiet nods of acknowledgement. But it was not just the child's innocence that drew admiration. It was the unspoken connection, the way mother and child moved almost as one. Her arms cradled the child protectively, her eyes reflecting unyielding love and a fierce determination to shield this small life from harm. She spoke to the child softly, words of guidance, lullabies and gentle assurances, shaping a world of security in a village that often teetered between serenity and latent tension. Yet even in this idyllic setting, envy had taken root. Some villagers could not bear the sight of such perfect harmony, the radiance of love so freely given and so deeply reciprocated. Whispers traveled in the shadowed corners of homes and markets, voices of jealousy wrapped in the guise of concern. "She has everything, beauty, a healthy child, respect from all," they murmured. "What right does she have to so much happiness when others toil endlessly for scraps?" Even some within her extended kin could not resist the pull of greed. They observed from a distance, feigning casual interest in her daily life while secretly plotting in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward her child with covetous glints, imagining how easy it would be to claim the joy that was not theirs. Despite the brewing malice around her, the mother's demeanor remained unshaken. She did not perceive the hatred behind polite smiles or the envy in muted conversations. Her days were filled with purpose, caring for the child, maintaining the modest home, and participating in village rituals with a generosity of spirit. She helped elders carry water, shared meals with neighbors in need, and comforted those who had no one to hear their troubles. Her kindness was consistent, unwavering, a force that many took for granted even as it inspired quiet resentment in others. Her home, simple yet warm, became a sanctuary not just for her child but for all who sought solace. The walls, decorated with woven mats and small tokens of affection, echoed with laughter and soft songs. The hearth always had a simmering pot of nourishing food, the aroma drawing neighbors who were fortunate enough to receive an invitation. The mother took care to treat everyone with dignity, offering help without expectation, providing counsel when asked, and shielding her child from the harsher realities of village life. Yet, the more she gave, the more envy festered, unnoticed by the kind-hearted woman who only saw the good in those around her. Her mornings began before the sun fully rose, tending to her garden and preparing meals. Her afternoons were spent playing with the child under the shade of the trees, letting the little one crawl and toddle freely while she watched with vigilant care. In these moments, laughter flowed easily, bright and pure, a balm against the ordinary struggles of life. But even amid these joyful scenes, the tension in the village simmered quietly. Eyes that should have offered warmth instead held suspicion, admiration twisted into desire, and smiles that seemed friendly were often masks concealing darker intentions. At times, she would notice subtle shifts in behavior, the way certain neighbors lingered too long, the way certain relatives offered unsolicited advice while casting lingering glances at her child. She dismissed these hints, trusting in the goodness of those around her and believing in the protection of her love and care. She could not yet see the storm that was gathering, hidden behind the polite faces of her community, driven by envy and greed, poised to strike at the one thing she cherished most. Her bond with her child was more than affection. It was instinct, intuition, and devotion entwined. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word reinforced the connection, a network of love that shielded her child from harm. Yet, in a village where envy could fester silently, love alone could not foresee the betrayal that would soon tear through the calm, shattering the peaceful life she had worked so hard to build. The innocent mother, radiant in kindness and unwavering in her devotion, remained blissfully unaware that the very bonds that defined her happiness were also the focus of malice that could erupt at any moment. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally still, as though the village itself was holding its breath. A soft drizzle fell, tapping lightly against the rooftops and leaves, masking the faint rustle of movement that crept through the shadows. The young mother had just settled her child into a small woven cradle by the fire, the little one's soft coos mingling with the gentle crackle of flames. She hummed a soothing melody, rocking the cradle slightly, her heart full of love and contentment. The tranquility of the evening, however, was a fragile illusion, one that would soon shatter in the most terrifying way imaginable. Outside, figures moved silently through the village, their steps calculated, careful to avoid snapping twigs or alerting anyone to their presence. They were driven by greed, envy, and dark intent, neighbors and distant kin who had long coveted the happiness of the young mother. Their eyes, cold and calculating, glimmered in the dim light as they approached the home, drawn to the unmistakable sound of laughter and coos emanating from within. Every careful step carried them closer to their target, the child, a symbol of joy and innocence and the object of their envy. Inside, the mother's attention was focused entirely on her child. She hummed, smiled, and murmured words of comfort, completely unaware that the very presence of those outside was a threat unlike any she had imagined. Her hands adjusted the blanket, ensuring the little one was warm and secure, her heart swelling with love. She did not hear the soft scratching of feet on the earth, the faint shifting of shadows at the edge of her door. The world outside her home seemed removed, almost a dream, while the warmth and light inside created a cocoon of safety, one that was about to be violently pierced. The first sign of danger came with a whisper, a subtle sound of movement, the faint creak of a door left slightly ajar. The mother paused, instinct prickling at the edges of her consciousness, but she dismissed it, attributing it to the wind or the settling of the house. Then, in a sudden, fluid motion, the intruders entered, their hands swift and practiced. Before she could react, one of them reached for the cradle, lifting it with shocking speed and precision. The mother's eyes widened in horror, her voice caught in her throat as her instinct screamed in alarm. She lunged toward the cradle, hands outstretched, heart hammering in her chest like a drum of war. "No. My child," she cried, her voice sharp with panic, slicing through the night. But the figures were stronger, more determined than she could have imagined. They forced the cradle from her grasp, holding it high above the ground as if mocking her desperation. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she stumbled to the floor, reaching desperately, the wooden slats of the cradle slipping further from her hands. Each second stretched into an eternity as the nightmare unfolded, her worst fears made real. The child began to cry, a high, piercing wail that seemed to echo beyond the walls of the home, filling the night air with sorrow and terror. The sound struck the mother like a physical blow, each scream unraveling her composure, turning panic into despair. Tears streamed down her face as she clawed at the intruders, her voice a mix of anguish and commands, "Stop! Please don't take my child. You have no right." But her pleas fell on ears hardened by greed and envy. They moved with cold efficiency, ignoring her cries, their resolve unshaken. The struggle intensified. She tried to grab the child, her hands clutching at the edges of the cradle, but her strength was no match for the coordinated effort of the thieves. The little one's cries grew louder, filled with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of danger, piercing through the mother's heart with unbearable force. Her chest ached, every breath a struggle, as she realized that reason and pleading would not reclaim her child. The figures carried the cradle toward the edge of the village, their feet splashing through puddles, leaving a trail of chaos behind. Neighbors who might have intervened were frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, unsure of what they were witnessing. The sudden violence of the theft, the raw anguish of the mother, and the child's desperate cries created a scene of horror that seemed almost unreal, a nightmare suspended in the rainy night. The mother's hands grasped at the empty air, her fingers scraping against mud and stone as she fell to her knees, powerless to stop what was happening. Her body shook violently, not from cold or fatigue, but from the overwhelming terror and despair that threatened to consume her entirely. Finally, the intruders vanished into the darkness, taking the child with them. The mother collapsed to the ground, the cradle gone, the cries of her child fading into the distance but leaving an echo that would never leave her mind. Her sobs tore through the night, loud enough to mingle with the soft patter of rain, each tear a testament to the helplessness and heartbreak she felt. The village, once a place of peace and security, now seemed a landscape of shadows and betrayal, every corner hiding the cruel intentions that had destroyed her life in a single irreversible moment. As she sat on the wet ground, trembling, she could only imagine where they had taken her child and what horrors awaited. The helplessness, the panic, and the pain were nearly unbearable, yet in the depths of despair, a spark of resolve began to kindle. Even as the darkness of the night pressed in and the rain soaked her, she realized that this was not the end, Not if the child's cry could reach her heart and stir a power she had never known before. In the quiet corners of the village, where the firelight barely reached and shadows stretched long across mud brick walls, whispers carried like currents through the air. People spoke cautiously, their voices low, careful to avoid prying ears. The theft of the child had shaken the village to its core, but beneath the terror lay something darker, a network of envy, greed, and old grudges that had been simmering quietly for years. Few spoke openly for fear of discovery, but those who knew the secrets understood that the child's abduction was no accident. It was deliberate, planned with patience and malice. Among those responsible were kin who had long nursed jealousy. Relatives who had envied the mother's kindness, her beauty, and her reputation in the village now saw their opportunity realized. For years they had watched her glow with joy and the affection of neighbors, her child a living symbol of hope and continuity. Each time the mother laughed or smiled, it deepened the envy, a gnawing dissatisfaction that made ordinary grievances fester into resentment. The child, small and innocent, became a prize, a vessel of their long-held desire to assert control, to claim what they believed was theirs by right or through cunning. Others among the villagers were driven by power and ambition. They saw in the child an object of leverage, a way to influence the mother, or a tool to manipulate her standing in the community. Whispers spread in hushed tones over fires and behind walls. If we take the child, she will be powerless. We will gain the upper hand. Some spoke of curses or ancient superstitions, claiming the child carried a blessing that, if removed, would diminish the mother's influence and elevate theirs. Fear of retaliation kept many silent, even as they suspected what was happening. The plotting was meticulous. Meetings were held in hidden corners, under the guise of ordinary errands or village work. Plans were whispered only to those who could be trusted, or at least controlled through threats and intimidation. Every step of the theft had been rehearsed, from the quiet movement through the village at night to the precise moment of seizing the child from her home. These were not careless people, they were individuals who had calculated every risk, confident that the night's shadows would shield their deeds from prying eyes. Yet, despite their careful planning, fear ran beneath the surface. Old beliefs lingered in the village, tales of spirits and curses passed down through generations. The thieves were not immune to these stories, and some secretly wondered whether the act of taking the child might awaken forces beyond their control. In hushed tones, they muttered warnings to each other, fearing divine or supernatural retribution. Even as they carried out the theft, a tension threaded through their hearts, a knowledge that actions born of envy and cruelty could have consequences they were ill-prepared to face. Among the villagers who had no part in the plotting, there was a sense of unease. Mothers whispered to their children, neighbors avoided eye contact, and elders shook their heads in quiet disapproval. They felt the weight of secrecy pressing down, sensing that something unnatural was unfolding. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, aware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface, the hidden networks of jealousy and greed ready to erupt into catastrophe. The mother's absence and the child's disappearance amplified the unease. Conversations were punctuated with anxious glances and trembling voices. Whispers carried fragments of suspicion, theories, and fear. It must be her cousin, someone said, or perhaps the family of the merchant who envies them. The unknown motivations behind the theft created a climate of suspicion that spread like wildfire. No one trusted anyone completely. The village became a place of shadows where secrets could fester unchecked. By the time the sun rose, casting light over empty streets and trembling villagers, the truth of the theft remained partially hidden. Only a few knew the full scope, the depth of envy, the cunning of the perpetrators, and the dark intentions that had driven them to commit such a heinous act. Yet even in secrecy, the weight of guilt and the fear of discovery began to take hold, setting the stage for consequences that would soon reach beyond human reckoning. The village's secrets were a living force, and the act of stealing the child had awakened something far older, far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The night air was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Then, without warning, a sound tore through the darkness, high-pitched, piercing, and impossibly pure. It was the cry of the stolen child, but no ordinary wail. It carried a resonance that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the village, vibrating through the trees, the river, and even the distant hills. The sound was at once small and yet immense, a paradox of innocence and power that could not be ignored. The thieves froze in their tracks, the child held tightly in their arms. They had expected fear, perhaps resistance, but nothing like this. The cry seemed to carry a life of its own, twisting and weaving through the night, echoing off rooftops, bouncing through alleyways, and flowing like a river of sound through the village. It was an unbearable clarity, a signal that something supernatural had awakened. Their hands trembled, eyes darting nervously, as though the very sky was demanding answers, exposing them for what they had done. Within the village, windows rattled and doors creaked open as families awoke to the unearthly sound. Mothers clutched their children, hearts pounding, while elders scrambled to understand what had broken the peace of the night. The cry was more than a human sound, it was a force penetrating every wall, slipping through cracks and chinks in the homes, stirring unease in every heart. Even those who had no hand in the theft felt the chill of fear settle deep in their bones. It was a voice that carried judgment, one that seemed to speak not just of loss, but of justice yet to be delivered. The sound shifted, rising and falling like waves on a storm-tossed sea. It was simultaneously a plea and a warning, blending sorrow, anger, and an almost conscious intent. Those who had committed the theft felt their guilt weigh heavily, each note of the cry slicing into their conscience. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the village walls, as though responding to the child's call. Leaves rustled in patterns too deliberate to be natural, and the river shimmered with reflected light that seemed to dance in time with the echoing cries. The mother, crouched behind the half-open door of her home, felt the cry reach her heart before it reached her ears. Her chest tightened, a mixture of anguish and hope striking her all at once. Every nerve in her body vibrated with the sound, and she could feel the presence of something beyond comprehension, a force tied intimately to her child. She did not need to see the child to know that this cry carried power, that it would not be ignored. In that moment she understood that her child was more than an innocent life. It was a conduit of judgment, a voice that would strike fear into the hearts of wrongdoers. The thieves' panic escalated as the cry intensified. It grew louder, sharper, reverberating through the village like a chorus of spectral voices. Their attempts to hush the child were futile. The sound seemed to mock them, twisting their fear into something palpable, almost physical. Every step they took was met with an eerie resistance. The ground beneath them felt alive, trembling subtly with the vibrations of the supernatural wail. The child's cry was no longer simply an alarm, it was a weapon, targeting the conscience and courage of those who dared to steal what was sacred. Even the natural world seemed to respond. Owls screeched, animals fled their hiding places, and the wind picked up, carrying the cry further than any human voice could travel. Trees bent slightly as if bowing to an unseen power, their leaves rustling in harmonics that echoed the child's own. It was a symphony of unrest, a reminder that forces beyond the understanding of mortals were now fully awake. The village itself felt the tremor of the sound, walls quivering, fires flickering, and every ear straining to make sense of what was happening. Those who had been silent observers of the night, neighbors who had not participated in the theft, now whispered nervously, fear threading their voices. "Do you hear it?" one asked, trembling. "It's as if the sky itself is crying for justice." Others nodded, eyes wide, realizing that the stolen child was no ordinary infant. Each note of the cry seemed to carry the weight of wrongs yet to be punished, an invisible force that could not be resisted. The cry did not diminish, it only grew in reach and intensity. It penetrated deep into the consciousness of the thieves, exposing their malice, their envy, and the cruelty that had driven them to commit the unthinkable. Panic overtook them entirely, their movements frantic and clumsy, as if the very air was working against them. No amount of running, hiding, or covering could silence it. The wail had become an instrument of reckoning, an unyielding declaration that justice was already at work, carried on a sound wave that no human could escape. By the time the first light of dawn touched the village, the echo of the child's cry had faded, but its impact lingered. The thieves were left trembling, guilt-stricken, and fearful, knowing that what they had done could never be undone. The villagers, too, remained haunted by the memory of the night, aware that something beyond human comprehension had been awakened. The child's cry had pierced the sky and in doing so, had announced that the balance of justice was shifting. No one in the village would ever forget the sound, nor the terrifying realization that innocence, once harmed, could summon forces beyond their reckoning. The first signs of the curse were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who had stolen the child. At first, it was only a shiver that ran down the spine, a sudden chill that cut through the warmth of the night. The thieves huddled together in their hidden corner of the forest, thinking that distance from the village could shield them from consequences. But the cry of the child had already pierced the veil between the mortal and the supernatural, a signal that awakened a force far older and far more relentless than any human anger. Every heartbeat of the mother, every tear she shed, had fused with the child's wail to summon a power that could no longer be ignored. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, charged with a strange electricity. Shadows lengthened and twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that were almost human, almost animal, but impossible to define. The thieves felt them first, a subtle pressure at the nape of the neck, a whisper of movement in the corner of their vision. Panic rose quickly, a gnawing, uncontrollable fear that pricked their consciousness and made their limbs tremble. They tried to laugh it off, convincing themselves that it was imagination, that the night had simply grown oppressive, but deep inside they knew better. Suddenly the first manifestations of the curse struck. The man who had carried the child felt an invisible grip tightening around his chest, constricting his breath. His hands clawed at the unseen force, and for a moment, he could feel the weight of every malicious thought he had harbored, the envy, the greed, the deliberate cruelty. The pressure intensified until he collapsed, gasping and trembling, his mind filled with visions of the child's pain. Each image was sharper, more vivid than reality, and every cry from the child resonated in his soul, a punishment he could neither escape nor deny. Those who had assisted him fared no better. The curse seemed to move with awareness, seeking out each conspirator with terrifying precision. Roots and vines, blackened and glistening, erupted from the ground beneath their feet, twisting around ankles, legs, and arms. Screams filled the air as each was ensnared, helpless against the growing fury of a force summoned by innocent anguish. The shadows moved in rhythm with the child's cries, rising and falling like tides, lashing out with limbs invisible yet impossibly strong. Panic turned to chaos as the thieves realized they were not facing mere superstition. They were confronting an entity born of pure, righteous wrath. In the village, signs of the curse began to appear almost simultaneously. Roof tiles cracked, doors slammed, and livestock bolted from their pens in blind terror. Windows rattled with the intensity of windless gusts, yet no wind blew. Those who had participated in the plotting, though physically distant, felt a spectral tug, a magnetic pull drawing them toward their reckoning. Even villagers who had done nothing wrong could sense the shift, the creeping weight of a justice that did not discriminate between distance and proximity. The world seemed unbalanced, as if the night itself had conspired to enact vengeance for the violated innocence of the child. The mother, sitting alone in her home, could feel the energy build, radiating outward from her heart. Each sob, each whisper of hope, each prayer to unseen forces had strengthened the curse, giving it shape, purpose, and direction. She did not understand the full extent of the power she had invoked, but instinctively she knew that it served justice. Her grief had become more than sorrow. It had become a catalyst for retribution, a tangible force reaching out to punish those who had wronged her and her child. By the second hour of the night, the curse had gained momentum. Thieves were tripping over roots that seemed to grow from nowhere, vines wrapping around arms, twisting and pulling with supernatural force. The man who had first carried the child was now lifted off the ground, suspended by shadowy tendrils that coiled around him like serpents. His screams were swallowed by the night but carried nonetheless through the echoing air, a chorus of fear that mingled with the child's cries, amplifying the supernatural effect. Panic turned to hysteria, and attempts to flee only tightened the grip of the curse, as though resistance fueled its strength. One by one, the conspirators were confronted by the manifestations of their sins. The woman who had whispered malicious advice felt her hair lift and twist, tightening around her wrists and neck, immobilizing her. The man who had spread rumors was beset by shadows that mimicked the child's small hands, pinching, scratching, and biting with an intensity that left marks not only on the flesh but on the soul. Each punishment was uniquely tailored, cruel yet perfectly just, reflecting the precise nature of the guilt and malice each had committed. By the third hour, the village itself seemed alive with the curse. Doors rattled violently, windows shattered, and the earth trembled faintly underfoot. Even those who had taken no part in the theft felt a shiver of fear and a sense of inevitability. Justice, it seemed, would not be denied. The cries of the child, amplified and carried by unseen forces, reverberated through the air, a call to arms for the supernatural, a sound that could not be ignored, a signal that the wrongdoer's punishment was absolute. As dawn approached, the night's chaos did not abate. The thieves were left broken, terrified, and physically marked by the curse. Each movement they made carried the shadow of retribution, a constant reminder that innocence violated could summon power beyond human comprehension. The mother, though exhausted and still grieving, remained untouched, her sorrow transformed into a protective and punishing force that had already reshaped the fate of those who dared to harm her child. The first light of dawn had yet to reach the village, but the night's chaos had already left its mark. The thieves were trapped in a living nightmare, surrounded by shadows that writhed like serpents, coiling around their limbs and constricting their movements. Every attempt to escape was met with supernatural resistance. The earth itself seemed to shift beneath them, roots erupting from the soil to entangle ankles, vines wrapping tightly around wrists. Their cries of panic mingled with the child's echoing wails, a sound that had grown into a relentless, accusing chorus, condemning them for their cruelty. Each thief faced punishment that was tailored to the sins they had committed. The man who had carried the child with cruel precision now felt invisible fingers claw at his conscience, forcing him to relive every moment of envy and malice that had led him to this crime. The guilt was physical as well as spiritual. His limbs burned with phantom wounds, his breath came in ragged gasps, and every muscle quivered from both terror and supernatural compulsion. Shadows mirrored the child's small hands, pinching, tugging, and scratching until his mind teetered on the edge of madness. The woman who had fueled the theft with whispered lies found her voice trapped in her throat, screaming silently as her shadow pressed against her chest, tightening with each syllable of deceit she had spoken. Her hands, which had manipulated and encouraged malice, were pinned, twisting in ways that made her feel as if she were bound by the very energy of the lies she had spread. Each lie manifested physically, roots, vines, and spectral tendrils wrapping her body, leaving marks that burned like fire but carried the precision of justice. Even the younger conspirators, those who had thought themselves less culpable, could not escape. Fear penetrated their hearts like ice, a freezing cold that radiated from the ground beneath them, up through their bones. Shadows pressed in from every angle, and the cries of the child seemed to echo within their very souls, amplifying the terror of the night. They stumbled blindly, but the curse had a will of its own, guiding the punishment directly toward each guilty party. Every misstep, every attempt to flee, only increased the grip of the supernatural force. The village itself had become a stage for chaos and judgment. Windows rattled violently as invisible hands slammed against the walls. Roof tiles shifted and fell, livestock stampeded in fright, and doors slammed open or shut without any human touch. Even the innocents of the village felt the oppressive weight of the curse, a chilling reminder that the consequences of cruelty and envy could ripple outward, affecting the community as a whole. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, mixing with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint, electric tang of unseen energy. The thieves' panic grew uncontrollable. They shouted, they pleaded, they clawed at the earth and the shadows, but every action seemed only to strengthen the curse. The child's cry, still carrying the unearthly resonance that had begun the punishment, intensified with every moment, as though the very essence of innocence and maternal anguish had coalesced into a single, unyielding force. The curse worked not just on the body but on the mind, unraveling confidence, patience, and hope, leaving only terror and realization of their wrongdoing. Some conspirators were lifted into the air by unseen forces, suspended above the earth as spectral hands held them aloft, dangling them over roots that writhed and threatened to impale or crush them. The weight of their guilt was physical, tangible, and relentless. Others were pressed into the mud, the soil itself binding and holding them as if the land had turned against them, refusing to allow escape. Every movement, every breath, was a painful reminder that justice, once invoked by innocent suffering, could not be evaded. Amidst this, the mother remained a distant, almost invisible anchor of power. Her grief and sorrow had transformed into a force that directed the curse with precision, ensuring that no harm fell upon the innocent and that the punishment corresponded exactly to the malice of the thieves. Her presence, though unseen, was felt in every quivering shadow, every tightening vine, every echoing cry. She did not need to act. Her anguish and the child's supernatural call were enough to orchestrate the reckoning with terrifying perfection. By the early morning, the thieves were reduced to trembling, broken figures. Some were physically bruised and scarred by the manifestations of their guilt. Others were mentally shattered, haunted by visions of the child's suffering and the consequences of their envy. The village, though physically intact in some areas, bore the psychological scars of the night, a landscape forever altered by the raw power of righteous vengeance. Fear lingered in the air, a tangible reminder that cruelty, once enacted, summons forces beyond mortal reckoning. The reckoning had begun, and in its wake, the thieves' terror, the village's chaos, and the supernatural justice of the child's cry left no room for doubt. Innocence violated could summon wrath both relentless and precise, a force that could not be contained, ignored, or evaded. From a distance, hidden behind the sheltering boughs of a great baobab tree, the mother watched the unfolding chaos with a heart both heavy and resolute. She could not intervene directly, her hands could not shield, her voice could not call the curse to pause. Yet, in the invisible threads that tied her spirit to her child, she felt every tremor of the supernatural wrath that now swept through the village. Her eyes, brimming with tears, reflected both sorrow and an unyielding determination. Though powerless in the physical sense, she had become the quiet architect of vengeance through the bond she shared with her child. Her mind roamed over the events that had led to this moment. She saw each act of betrayal, each whisper of malice, and the cruel hands that had stolen her child. The memory of her child's frightened eyes, the helpless clutch of tiny hands, and the echoing wail that had pierced the night fueled the fire within her. In that quiet, distant vigil, she transformed grief into resolve, pain into purpose. The child's suffering, amplified by the unnatural cries that reached the heavens, became a conduit for justice far beyond human capacity. Though unseen by the villagers, the mother's presence was palpable. She felt the subtle movements of the curse as it twisted through the village, sensing the balance between destruction and precision. Each flash of fear on a thief's face, each struggle against the spectral roots and shadows, was mirrored in her own spirit. She wept silently, not from despair alone, but from the magnitude of the power her anguish had summoned. Every tear shed carried intent, reinforcing the force that her child had called into being. The villagers who had not participated in the theft sensed her watching, though they could not see her. A strange energy hung over the night, a presence both protective and punitive. Animals trembled and sought shelter, the wind carried whispers, and even the air seemed charged with something ancient. The mother's spiritual connection extended outward, threading through the chaos with a quiet, commanding influence. Though she made no sound, no gesture, the outcomes were guided by her anguish and her unwavering commitment to her child's safety and justice. Time seemed suspended as she observed the cursed retribution. The thieves' terror, the vines that constricted, and the shadows that moved with a terrifying life of their own unfolded before her like a living tapestry. She felt no joy in the suffering of others, only the stark satisfaction that justice, once beyond her reach, was now manifest. Her role was not to act with violence but to bear witness and lend the weight of her sorrow to the supernatural force, ensuring that each punishment was measured, precise, and fitting to the crime committed. Though separated from the scene, her resilience became a silent force. She remained seated beneath the tree, unwavering, her heart tethered to her child, her spirit intertwined with the curse. Every flicker of light from the struggling shadows, every cry of terror from the guilty, resonated through her as though she were both the source and observer. It was a sacred duty, born from the depths of maternal love, sorrow, and the need for balance. Her quiet power, intangible yet undeniable, guided the chaos with a wisdom born of instinct and grief. As the night waned and the first light of dawn threatened to break the darkness, the mother's vigil did not falter. She understood that her role was as vital as the child's cry, as essential as the curse itself. Through her sorrow and resilience, through her silent presence and unwavering spirit, she had become a conduit of justice, a witness to the reckoning, and a protector who had transformed grief into a force the world could not ignore. The night had grown dense with shadows, yet it pulsed with a strange, almost sentient energy, as if the air itself were alive with judgment. The village, once familiar and safe, had become a stage for reckoning, each crooked corner and narrow alleyway imbued with the wrath of the wronged child and the grief of her mother. The guilty could feel it, an invisible hand pressing against their chests, tightening their lungs, rattling their teeth, and constricting their hearts with the weight of fear and anticipation. The first to face the curse was the man who had stolen the child. He had thought to move swiftly, hiding in the shadows and keeping his mouth shut, believing that physical distance could shield him from consequences. But the moment he took a single step, the roots of the earth seemed to rise beneath his feet. They slithered up his legs, twisting like serpents, sinking deep into the soil and clinging with supernatural strength. He fell to the ground, struggling in vain as the roots constricted further, burning into his flesh yet leaving no mark visible to the human eye. Each movement was matched by an unrelenting pressure that mirrored the fear in his heart, a punishment as mental as it was physical. The woman who had whispered venomous lies to the neighbors found herself immobilized as the shadows gathered around her. They swirled in patterns that mimicked the shape of the child's tiny hands, each spectral finger probing her thoughts, her memories, dredging up every secret act of malice she had committed. Her breath caught in her throat as her shadow itself seemed to rebel, rising from the ground and pressing against her, as though the innocence she had tried to destroy had taken form to confront her directly. The feeling was suffocating, a reminder that malice would never escape consequence. Those who had spread rumors, encouraged jealousy, or simply turned a blind eye were not spared. Vines erupted from walls, floors and ceilings, curling and twisting around ankles, wrists and necks, pulling with a precision that suggested awareness. The vines were merciless, yet they inflicted only as much as necessary, mirroring the severity of each individual's wrongdoing. Some felt the sharp bite of leaves as they scratched and tore, while others were pressed face-first into mud, forced to confront the ground they had once walked upon with careless pride. Every punishment was tailored, almost sentient, balancing pain with the teaching of fear and respect for what had been violated. The child's supernatural cry continued to echo through the village, its resonance strengthening the curse. Each note penetrated walls and floors, vibrating through bones and hearts alike. The guilty could not ignore it. It was a voice of innocence, pure and untouchable, carrying both sorrow and righteous anger. They fell to their knees as they realized that no escape was possible. The cry was everywhere, entwined with the very air, water and soil of the village. Each heartbeat seemed synchronized with the echoes, a relentless drum of reckoning that tracked every misdeed, every malicious thought and every act of cruelty. The man who had first carried the child was lifted into the air by unseen forces, dangling above a pit of writhing roots that pulsed like serpents. He screamed, and the shadows around him responded, tightening their grip with every sound, amplifying his terror. Each memory of envy, fear, or malice he had ever harbored pressed upon him, each one made tangible and unavoidable. He realized with bone-deep horror that the punishment was not only physical, it struck at the very essence of his being, leaving him broken and trembling, a shadow of his former self. Meanwhile, the woman who had orchestrated much of the envy and gossip was confronted by shadows that mimicked her own reflection. Each movement she made was countered by a shadowy twin that twisted, bent, and pulled at her, exposing her own guilt and forcing her to relive every word she had spoken against the innocent. She clawed at the shadows, but they were relentless, moving faster than thought, responding to her panic, her fear and her desperation. Every attempt at escape only tightened the punishment, as though the curse itself had a conscious understanding of justice. Even the younger conspirators, those who had considered themselves minor participants, faced consequences. Shadows wrapped around their limbs, roots grasped at their ankles, and their own reflections appeared in impossible places, mirrors, puddles and glass surfaces, mocking them, showing the malice they had tried to hide. Fear gnawed at them from the inside out, and their minds teetered on the brink of madness. Each saw visions of the child's suffering amplified by their actions, making every misdeed impossible to deny. The village itself bore witness, trembling under the weight of supernatural forces. Roof tiles cracked and fell, doors slammed with deafening force, livestock scattered in panic, and the air itself seemed to thrum with the energy of judgment. Even those who had done nothing wrong watched in silent horror, feeling the echoes of the curse brush against their consciousness, a chilling reminder that evil deeds, once set in motion, summon forces beyond human comprehension. By the end of the night, the guilty lay broken, terrified, and forever marked, not necessarily on the skin but on their spirits. Every step they had taken to harm the child had been met with precise, unyielding justice. The mother's anguish and the child's supernatural cry had orchestrated a reckoning that could not be escaped, leaving no room for denial or justification. The collapse of the guilty was complete, their terror absolute, and their awareness that innocence, once harmed, invokes powers beyond mortal reckoning indelibly etched into their souls. The first light of dawn barely pierced the heavy, mist-laden sky over the village, yet an eerie silence hung everywhere, more oppressive than the fiercest storm. The chaos of the previous night had ended, but the air remained thick with tension and fear. Every house, every street corner, seemed imbued with the echoes of terror that had swept through the village. The cries of the child, the shrieks of the guilty, and the supernatural forces that had delivered swift, precise justice. The survivors moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if daring to breathe too loudly might awaken the wrath still lingering in the shadows. Villagers emerged from their homes, trembling and wide-eyed, surveying the aftermath. Broken doors, scattered belongings, and churned earth bore the unmistakable marks of the night's otherworldly events. Windows had shattered under the invisible force of the curse, livestock was scattered across fields, and the streets were marred by twisted vines and blackened roots that had ensnared the guilty. A few brave children peered from behind their parents' skirts, sensing that something beyond human comprehension had taken place, yet too young to fully grasp the magnitude. Adults, however, knew the truth. The child's cry had summoned powers that no one could challenge, and the village had paid the price for its envy, greed, and cruelty. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Survivors exchanged hurried words, careful not to draw attention from the unseen forces still lingering. Stories of what had occurred, some witnessed, some only inferred, were shared in hushed tones. They spoke of shadows that moved with intent, vines that could grasp and punish, and cries so piercing that the guilty had fallen without hope of escape. Fear clung to them, a heavy cloak that would not lift, no matter how far they walked or how deep they tried to bury their memories. Each villager understood that the child's supernatural cry had permanently altered the balance of their lives. Even those who had done nothing to provoke the wrath felt its weight. The knowledge that cruelty could summon vengeance beyond mortal control instilled a collective humility in the community. They looked at one another with wary eyes, aware that any misstep, any act of malice or envy, might awaken similar forces again. The village had become a place of reflection and trepidation. Laughter was subdued, conversations cautious, and children were warned repeatedly never to harm the innocent. The memory of the night was carved into the collective consciousness, an indelible mark of fear and reverence for powers beyond their understanding. The mother, now distant from the village physically but still spiritually connected through the echoes of her child's cry, watched silently as the survivors wandered the streets. Though unseen, her presence was felt, a reminder that innocence, once harmed, could call forth justice in forms that defied human comprehension. Her sorrow remained, but it had transformed into a quiet, lingering authority. The village knew, even subconsciously, that the night's events were not over in spirit. Every glance, every shadow, every whisper of the wind could carry a fragment of the child's cry, a silent warning that wrongdoing had consequences beyond human reckoning. The guilty, or those who had survived by chance or distance, cowered in shame and terror. Some attempted to justify their actions in hushed murmurs, blaming circumstance or minimizing their involvement, but the evidence of their fear was undeniable. Eyes darted nervously to every shadow, every swaying branch and every reflective surface, as though the child's eyes or the echo of her cries could manifest at any moment. The village had learned that fear, once instilled by supernatural justice, lingered far longer than the event itself, shaping thoughts, actions and interactions indefinitely. The atmosphere was thick with humility and vigilance. Families huddled together, parents whispering to children about kindness, respect, and the perils of jealousy. Even routine tasks were undertaken with care, as villagers were acutely aware that their environment was no longer solely under human dominion. They walked lightly over paths where roots had risen, avoided areas where shadows seemed unusually deep, and kept their voices low, respecting the invisible presence that had so decisively intervened in their affairs. Every sound of wind, rustle of leaves, or distant bird call was interpreted as a reminder. The child's cry had power, and that power had reshaped the village permanently. By mid-morning, some semblance of daily life resumed, yet the quiet was uncanny, almost reverential. Survivors moved with careful, deliberate steps, carrying the memory of the night in their hearts. Fields were tended, water drawn from wells, fires lit for cooking, yet the underlying tension remained. Even the strongest voices spoke softly, every gesture careful, every glance measured. It was clear to all that the village would never again take innocence or kindness for granted. The child's cry had not only punished but had instilled a lasting vigilance and reverence for life and the forces that guarded it. As the sun rose higher, casting light upon the battered village, the survivors' expressions revealed more than fear. They carried respect, awe, and an understanding that the balance between innocence and malice was delicate and sacred. The echoes of the child's cry would linger in memory, teaching lessons through silence and observation rather than words. The village had been forever altered. The events of the night would shape generations, a lasting testament to the power of justice, the strength of maternal love, and the inevitability of retribution for those who dared to harm the innocent.